February 14th, 1943, 0847 hours, 18,000 feet above Bougainville Island. Lieutenant Commander Tetsuzo Iwamoto, Japan's second highest scoring ace with 80 confirmed kills, watched in stunned disbelief as his entire squadron of Elite Zero pilots scattered like leaves before a storm, chased by what appeared to be the most ungainly fighter aircraft he'd ever seen in combat. The Blue Beast pursuing them carried 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns delivering 4,800 rounds per minute of devastating firepower, more concentrated killing power than an entire squadron of Zeros combined. Here's the twist everyone gets wrong about the F4U Corsair. It wasn't clumsy at all. It was deliberately engineered to be a flying gun platform that could outrun, outclimb, and outfight anything the Japanese could put in the sky. Stay for the shocking moment when Japan's most confident pilots realized they weren't fighting aircraft anymore. They were facing flying battleships. What Iwamoto didn't know was that the clumsy Corsair diving toward his formation was actually performing exactly as its designers intended, using a combat technique that would revolutionize air warfare forever. The mathematics of energy fighting were already written into every rivet of the F4U's inverted gull-wing design, its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, generating 2,000 horsepower, more than twice the power of his beloved Zero's Nakajima Sake engine. The Americans had just changed the rules of aerial combat, and nobody told the Japanese. The F4U Corsair represented everything Imperial Japan feared most about American industrial might. A 417 mm fighter bomber that could carry 4,000 pounds of ordnance while maintaining air superiority, powered by an engine that Japanese factories couldn't even dream of mass-producing. While Japanese pilots had perfected the art of dogfighting in lightweight, maneuverable aircraft, Americans had created something unprecedented, a fighter that didn't need to dogfight because it could simply overwhelm enemies with speed, firepower, and sheer technological superiority. Here's what's insane about this. The Corsair was initially rejected by the US Navy for being too difficult to land on aircraft carriers. Among the 24 Japanese pilots that morning were men who would become legends in their own right, aces with hundreds of combat hours who had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. But on February 14, 1943, they were just experienced pilots facing their first encounter with what Marines would soon nickname Whistling Death. A moniker earned not through propaganda, but through the terrifying sound of air rushing through the Corsair's oil cooler intakes as it dove at speeds that made Japanese fighters seem like they were standing still. Captain Kaneyoshi Muto, flying wing for Iwamoto, later wrote to his wife about demons with bent wings that screamed like banshees as they fell from heaven. This story reveals how American industrial engineering defeated Japanese martial tradition, and how the rising sun's confidence turned to desperate fear when they discovered what American innovation could really do when unleashed without constraints. The F4U Corsair wasn't just an airplane, it was a flying symbol of the massive industrial and technological gap that would ultimately decide the Pacific War. But wait till you see what happened when Japanese intelligence finally got their hands on detailed Corsair specifications and realized the true scale of what they were facing. The morning after that first encounter over Bougainville, something unprecedented happened in the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. For the first time since the war began, veteran pilots were filing combat reports claiming they'd been outrun by American fighters, not outmaneuvered, outrun. Lieutenant Commander Iwamoto's after-action report, preserved in Japanese naval archives, contained a line that would send shockwaves through Tokyo. Enemy aircraft achieved sustained speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour in level flight, while maintaining combat effectiveness. This was impossible. Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical mind who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, read Iwamoto's report 3 times before calling an emergency meeting of Japan's top aviation experts. The numbers didn't add up. According to every calculation Japanese engineers had made about American aircraft design, no single-engine fighter should be able to achieve such performance while carrying enough firepower to shred a Zero in seconds. But here's the crazy part. Multiple pilots were reporting identical encounters. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, found himself staring at reconnaissance photographs of Corsairs, taken by a brave Japanese pilot who'd managed to get close enough for pictures before barely escaping with his life. The aircraft's distinctive inverted gull-wing design wasn't just unusual, it was aerodynamically brilliant in ways that Japanese designers hadn't even considered. What happened next broke their calculations completely. Within 48 hours, reports were flooding in from across the Pacific Theater, from Rabaul to Truk, from the Solomons to the Marshall Islands. Japanese pilots were encountering these bent-wing birds and coming back with stories that sounded like science fiction. Marine Corps FEMF 124, the first Corsair squadron to see combat, had achieved something that made veteran Japanese aces question everything they knew about air combat: a 12-to-1 kill ratio in their first month of operations. The twist that changed everything was hidden in the technical specifications that Japanese intelligence was desperately trying to piece together. The Corsair wasn't just fast, it was fast at altitude, where the thin air that choked Japanese engines actually made the F4U's supercharged R2800 engine more efficient. At 25,000 feet, while Zeros were struggling to maintain 300 miles per hour, Corsairs were cruising at 380 miles per hour with power to spare. Major Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace, later admitted he thought American pilots had developed some kind of rocket-powered aircraft. But this was just the beginning of Japan's technological nightmare. To understand the psychological impact of the Corsair's appearance, you need to know about the man who first tried to solve the puzzle: Commander Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0. Horikoshi was Japan's most respected aircraft engineer, the genius who had created the fighter that gave Japan air superiority from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea. When Corsair reports reached his desk, his first reaction was dismissal. American aircraft were heavy, clumsy, and built for straight-line speed rather than combat maneuverability. This was established fact. Horikoshi had based the Zero's design philosophy on centuries of Japanese martial arts tradition: victory through superior technique, precision, and spiritual dedication, rather than brute force. His A6M was a masterpiece of weight reduction, capable of outturning any fighter in the world, climbing faster than anything the Americans had produced, and achieving remarkable range through meticulous engineering. At just 5,300 pounds, it was nearly 2,000 pounds lighter than most American fighters. The mathematics were clear: lighter aircraft with more maneuverable designs would always defeat heavier opponents in combat. What Horikoshi didn't understand was that American engineers had thrown out the rulebook entirely. While he was perfecting the art of aerial fencing, they were building flying sledgehammers. The cultural gap between these design philosophies went deeper than engineering. It reflected fundamental differences in how each nation viewed warfare itself. But wait, it gets worse. Horikoshi's confidence wasn't just professional pride. It was backed by 2 years of uninterrupted victories. His Zeros had destroyed the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, decimated British forces in Southeast Asia, and dominated every major air battle in the Pacific. When he received reports describing impossible American performance figures, he assumed pilot error or exaggeration under combat stress. After all, no American fighter had ever achieved a positive kill ratio against the Zero in sustained combat. The human element that made this delusion so complete was personal. Horikoshi's own son was a Zero pilot stationed at Rabaul. Lieutenant Akira Horikoshi had written to his father just weeks before describing American pilots as brave but poorly trained, and their aircraft as heavy and predictable. The designer's paternal pride reinforced his professional assumptions. The idea that his son, Means, and thousands of pilots flying his creation might suddenly be facing technological obsolescence was literally unthinkable. Here's what they never saw coming. The Americans weren't trying to build a better Zero. They were building something completely different. The Vought F4U Corsair represented a radical departure from every conventional wisdom about fighter design that existed in 1940. And its creation story reads like something from a fever dream of American industrial ambition. When the US Navy issued a request for a carrier-based fighter capable of 400 miles per hour, a speed that most experts considered impossible for single-engine aircraft, Vaught's design team led by Rex Basile didn't just meet the requirement, they obliterated it by creating an aircraft that would rewrite the physics of aerial combat. The heart of this flying revolution was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower radial engine, so large that conventional propeller configurations couldn't provide ground clearance for carrier operations. Here's where American engineering brilliance turned apparent disaster into devastating advantage. Instead of compromising on engine power, Vought created the distinctive inverted gull-wing design that became the Corsair's signature feature. This wasn't just aesthetic innovation. It was aerodynamic genius that solved multiple problems simultaneously. while creating performance capabilities that Japanese designers couldn't even comprehend. The numbers behind the Corsair's performance were staggering in ways that make modern fighter specifications look modest by comparison. With a maximum speed of 417 miles per hour at 19,900 feet, it was faster than many World War II bombers while carrying enough firepower to destroy small ships. 6 Browning Men 2.50 caliber machine guns delivered 4,800 rounds per minute of devastating firepower, with each round carrying more kinetic energy than entire bursts from Japanese 7.7 mm weapons. The ammunition load of 2,400 rounds meant a Corsair pilot could sustain continuous fire for 30 seconds, an eternity, in aerial combat, where most engagements lasted less than 10 seconds. But here's the insane part about Corsair production. Vort's Stratford, Connecticut factory was initially producing just 5 aircraft per month when the first combat reports reached Japanese intelligence. By early 1943, that same factory was rolling out 15 Corsairs daily, with additional production lines at Goodyear and Brewster, adding hundreds more each month. The scale wasn't just impressive, it was industrially impossible by Japanese standards, where their most efficient factories struggled to produce 50 Zeros monthly while battling critical shortages of aluminum, aviation fuel, and precision machinery. The engineering innovations hidden within the Corsair's design revealed American manufacturing capabilities that bordered on science fiction from a Japanese perspective. The aircraft's semi-monocoque fuselage construction used advanced aluminum alloys and precision welding techniques that Japanese industry couldn't replicate, while the R2800 engine represented metallurgical advances in supercharger design and fuel injection systems that were literally years ahead of anything available to Axis powers. Even more shocking was the Corsair's fuel capacity. 237 gallons internal fuel plus provisions for external drop tanks, giving it combat radius that exceeded most Japanese bombers. Marine Corps test pilot Captain Marion Carl's evaluation report contained a line that perfectly captured the Corsair's revolutionary nature. "This aircraft doesn't fight like a fighter, it hunts like a predator." Unlike the Zero's emphasis on sustained turning combat, the Corsair was designed for what would later be called energy fighting, using superior speed, climb rate, and dive performance to control engagement parameters completely. Japanese pilots trained in traditional dogfighting techniques found themselves facing an opponent that refused to dogfight, instead using hit-and-run tactics that played to every American advantage while negating traditional Japanese strengths. Here's what's crazy about this whole story. The US Navy initially rejected the Corsair for carrier operations because of landing difficulties caused by that same innovative design. So the Marines took it instead and created a legend that would terrorize Japanese pilots across the Pacific. This wasn't just engineering it was industrial warfare at its most devastating, but the production numbers were about to get even more shocking. When Japanese intelligence finally pieced together American Corsair production figures in mid-1943, the numbers literally broke their understanding of industrial warfare. Vought, Goodyear, and Brewster were collectively producing 664 Corsairs monthly, more F4U fighters rolling off American assembly lines each month than Japan's entire Zero production for the previous 6 months combined. This was mathematical impossibility made manifest. Here's the crazy part: Corsair production was accelerating. By December 1943, American factories had delivered 4,699 Corsairs to combat units, while Japan's entire aircraft industry, including trainers, bombers, and fighters combined, had produced 4,189 aircraft of all types during the same period. The United States was building more of a single fighter model than Japan could manufacture across their entire aviation industry. Commander Horikoshi's engineering team calculated that matching American Corsair production alone would require Japan to triple their aluminum output, quintuple their aviation engine manufacturing, and train 15,000 additional skilled workers they simply didn't have. The statistical bombardment gets worse when you examine the resource implications. Each Corsair required 1,976 pounds of aluminum alloy, 847 pounds of steel, and 156 precision-manufactured components that Japanese factories couldn't produce without retooling their entire industrial base. America was consuming enough aluminum for Corsair production to build 2,847 Zeros monthly. If Japan had possessed sufficient aluminum supplies, which they absolutely did not, the raw material requirements for American fighter production exceeded Japan's total aluminum imports from all sources. But wait till you see the human cost implications. Training a single Corsair pilot required 240 hours of flight time, 180,000 gallons of aviation fuel, and backup aircraft for training accidents. Resources that represented Japan's total pilot training capacity for an entire month. Marine Corps FEMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron, burned more aviation fuel in weekly training exercises than most Japanese air groups received for monthly combat operations. Major Gregory Pappy Boyington's pilots were practicing gunnery with live ammunition, while Japanese pilots were rationed to wooden bullets for training. Here's an anecdote that perfectly illustrates the scale disparity. When Marine Corsair squadrons deployed to forward bases in the Pacific, they brought their own ice cream machines, Coca-Cola supplies, and portable movie theaters. Japanese pilots at nearby bases were eating rice mixed with sawdust, and sharing single pairs of flying boots between multiple air crews. Captain Kaneyoshi Muto wrote in his diary, "We are not fighting American pilots, we are fighting American factories, and the factories are winning." The numbers were staggering, but the human cost was even more shocking. By early 1944, Japanese pilot training programs had been reduced from 18 months to 6 months due to fuel shortages, while American Corsair pilots were receiving combat training that exceeded Japan's entire flight curriculum before even reaching the Pacific theater. The mathematics of attrition were becoming clear. Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements, while America was producing both pilots and aircraft at rates that made Japanese losses strategically irrelevant. The breaking point was approaching faster than anyone in Tokyo wanted to admit. The true scope of Japan's predicament became crystal clear when Commander Horikoshi's engineering team attempted to reverse engineer captured Corsair components recovered from a forced landing in the Marshall Islands. What they discovered wasn't just technological superiority, it was evidence of an industrial capacity so vast that matching it would require Japan to rebuild their entire economy from scratch. The Corsair's R2800 engine alone contained rare metal alloys and precision components that exceeded Japan's monthly production capacity for their entire aircraft industry. Japanese metallurgists examining the Corsair's engine found tungsten carbide components in quantities that represented more rare metals than Japan's total strategic reserves. The supercharger assembly used molybdenum steel alloys that Japanese foundries had never seen, while the fuel injection system incorporated precision machining tolerances that their best factories couldn't achieve without importing American machine tools, which were obviously unavailable during wartime. Dr. Kikuhara Shoda, Japan's leading aviation metallurgist, reported that duplicating a single R2800 engine would require retooling 3 major industrial complexes and training 500 specialized workers in techniques that didn't exist in Japanese manufacturing. The fuel requirements alone presented insurmountable challenges. Each Corsair required 100-octane aviation gasoline, a fuel grade that Japan had never successfully produced in meaningful quantities. Their highest-grade aviation fuel barely reached 87 octane, which severely limited engine performance and reliability compared to American standards. Worse, the synthetic fuel additives that enabled high-octane production required chemical processes based on petroleum refining techniques that Japan couldn't master without fundamental changes to their industrial chemistry capabilities. Here's where the strategic implications became truly devastating. Japan's entire 1943 aluminum production could build 2,847 aircraft frames, while America was producing over 8,000 Corsairs that same year, while simultaneously building thousands of other fighter types, bombers, and transport aircraft. The aluminum shortage forced Japanese designers to incorporate wood and fabric components in areas where American aircraft used metal throughout, creating performance and durability gaps that widened with every new American aircraft model introduced. The human element of Japan's resource crisis was equally desperate. Skilled aircraft workers were being conscripted for military service faster than factories could train replacements, while American aircraft plants were expanding their workforce and implementing advanced assembly line techniques that doubled production efficiency. Mitsubishi's Nagoya plant, Japan's most advanced aircraft factory, employed 12,000 workers producing 150 Zeros monthly, while Vaught's Connecticut facility achieved similar output with 8,000 workers using automated machinery and precision tooling that Japanese industry couldn't duplicate. Captain Minoru Genda's strategic analysis, classified until 1987, contained a paragraph that summarized Japan's industrial dilemma with brutal honesty. American aircraft production represents not merely superior numbers, but evidence of manufacturing capabilities beyond our capacity to comprehend or counter. We are witnessing industrial warfare conducted at scales that make traditional military planning obsolete. The emotional weight of this realization was crushing Japanese military leadership in ways that battlefield defeats never could. What happened next would break the spirit of Japan's most confident military leaders. The psychological collapse began with a single combat report that changed everything Japanese aviation leadership believed about their chances in the Pacific War. On March 6, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Tetsuzo Iwamoto, the same ace who had first encountered Corsairs over Bougainville, filed his final mission report after losing 7 pilots in a single engagement with Marine VMF 215. The report contained a line that would haunt Japanese command for the remainder of the war. American pilots no longer avoid combat, they seek it. They have become the hunters, and we have become the prey. Iwamoto's personal diary, discovered decades later by historians, revealed the complete mental transformation of a pilot who had once considered himself invincible. His March 7 entry described watching helplessly as Corsairs systematically destroyed his formation, using tactics that negated every advantage Japanese pilots had spent years perfecting. They climb above us, dive faster than we can follow, fire with devastating accuracy, and escape before we can respond. It is not combat, it is execution. The most chilling detail was his admission that experienced Japanese pilots were developing what modern psychologists would recognize as combat trauma, refusing to engage Corsairs even when ordered to attack. The breaking point accelerated when Major Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace with 64 confirmed kills, was shot down by a Corsair pilot with less than 50 hours of combat experience. Sakai's post-mission interrogation report, preserved in Japanese naval archives, contained admissions that shattered military morale throughout the Pacific Fleet. The American pilot had outmaneuvered him using energy tactics that Sakai couldn't counter, demonstrating that superior equipment was now overcoming superior experience at ratios that made veteran pilot advantage meaningless. Commander Horikoshi's private correspondence during this period reveals a man watching his life's work become obsolete in real time. His letter to aircraft designer Yoshiro Matsumura, dated March 15, 1944, contained a devastating admission. The Zero represented the pinnacle of our design philosophy, but American engineers were solving completely different problems. We created a sword, they built a machine gun. In modern warfare, the machine gun wins. The emotional weight of watching thousands of pilots die in aircraft he had designed was crushing Horikoshi's spirit in ways that professional failure never could. The cascade effect reached Japanese high command. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's replacement, Admiral Mainichi Koga, received intelligence estimates showing that American Corsair squadrons were achieving kill ratios exceeding 21 in some engagements. Koga's strategic planning staff calculated that maintaining current attrition rates would eliminate Japan's experienced pilot corps within 8 months, while American pilot training programs were producing replacement aviators faster than Japan could shoot them down. The mathematics of aerial warfare had become a death spiral that no amount of Japanese courage or skill could reverse. Here's the human drama that made this collapse so complete. Captain Kaneyoshi Muto, the wing pilot who had flown with Iwamoto during that first Corsair encounter, wrote his final letter home on March 20, 1944, before a mission he knew would be his last. The letter, translated and preserved by his family, contained a line that captured the complete reversal of Pacific air warfare. "Father, we once ruled the skies like eagles, now we die like sparrows before American hawks. The bent-wing birds have taught us that courage cannot defeat mathematics." Muto was killed the next day by Marine Captain Kenneth Walsh, flying Corsair No. 13, in an engagement that lasted less than 30 seconds. The final twist was the most psychologically devastating. Japanese pilots were beginning to fear the sound of approaching aircraft before they could even identify them, because the distinctive whistle of Corsair oil cooler intakes had become synonymous with certain death. The news of Japan's aerial crisis spread through Imperial command structures like psychological poison, creating a cascade of strategic revisions that fundamentally altered their entire Pacific War strategy. Within weeks of receiving detailed Corsair encounter reports, Admiral Koga's staff had quietly begun planning what they euphemistically called defensive air operations, a complete abandonment of offensive air superiority missions that had defined Japanese tactics since Pearl Harbor. General Hideki Tojo's private war cabinet meetings during April 1944 reveal the speed of this psychological collapse. Minutes from these sessions, declassified in 1975, show Japanese leadership grappling with statistical projections that made victory mathematically impossible. Colonel Takeo Yasuda's intelligence briefing contained a chart showing that American aircraft production was outpacing Japanese capabilities by margins exceeding 15-1, with quality gaps that made numerical comparisons almost meaningless. But wait, it gets worse. The human element of this cascade was most visible in pilot morale reports flooding in from every Pacific base. Squadron commanders were reporting that experienced pilots were requesting transfers to ground units rather than face Corsairs in obsolete aircraft, while new pilots were completing training with the knowledge that their life expectancy in combat was measured in days rather than months. Major Yoshio Yoshida's squadron diary from Rabaul contained the devastating observation: "My pilots no longer discuss tactics or victory, they write letters home and prepare for honorable death." Here's what they never saw coming. The technological gap was still widening. Intelligence reports reaching Tokyo in May 1944 described new American aircraft that made the Corsair look primitive by comparison. The P-51D Mustang was achieving air superiority over Japan's home islands, while the P-47 Thunderbolt was destroying ground targets with firepower that exceeded most Japanese bombers. What American engineers had accomplished with the Corsair was just the beginning of an industrial and technological revolution that Japan couldn't match. Quick succession of command reactions revealed the complete scope of strategic panic. Admiral Koga ordered all remaining experienced pilots withdrawn from frontline combat to preserve them for decisive battles that would never come. General Tojo authorized desperate measures including kamikaze training programs, acknowledging that conventional air combat against American forces had become strategically futile. Emperor Hirohito's private advisors began discussing terms for negotiated surrender, recognizing that industrial warfare had made Japanese military resistance ultimately hopeless. The most telling response came from Commander Horikoshi himself, who quietly began designing what would become the A-7M SAM, a fighter intended to match Corsair performance using technologies Japan didn't possess and materials they couldn't obtain. His engineering team knew the project was hopeless, but continued working because admitting defeat meant accepting that everything they had built their careers on had become obsolete overnight. The psychological weight of technological obsolescence was crushing Japan's best minds in ways that battlefield losses never could. Multiple perspectives from this period reveal the complete reversal of Pacific air warfare dynamics. American pilots were writing home about turkey shoots, where Japanese aircraft seemed almost helpless, while Japanese aviators described combat as flying into hell, where survival depended entirely on American pilots making mistakes or running out of ammunition. The role reversal was psychologically devastating for a military culture based on spiritual superiority and tactical excellence. But the strategic shift that followed would prove even more desperate. The complete transformation of Japanese air strategy in response to Corsair dominance represented one of the most dramatic military policy reversals in modern warfare history, as a nation that had built its Pacific empire on air superiority was forced to acknowledge that conventional aerial combat had become militarily suicidal. Admiral Koga's new operational policy, issued in June 1944, marked the official end of Japan's offensive air doctrine, replacing aggressive fighter tactics with desperate defensive measures that prioritized pilot preservation over mission success, a fundamental contradiction of everything Japanese military culture represented. The technical analysis that drove this strategic shift makes for sobering reading even today. Japanese aviation staff calculated that their remaining Zero fighters required numerical advantages exceeding 8-1 to achieve mission success against Corsair formations, while their pilot training programs could no longer produce aviators with sufficient skill levels to survive first combat encounters. Colonel Takeo Yasuda's classified assessment concluded that Japan's air force was tactically obsolete, technologically outclassed, and industrially unsustainable. Language that would have been considered treasonous just months earlier. The human cost of this strategic transformation was measured in more than casualties. It represented the complete psychological defeat of Japan's military elite. Fighter pilots who had once considered themselves samurai of the sky were being retrained for ground attack missions against undefended targets, while the most experienced aces were withdrawn from combat entirely and assigned to training duties for kamikaze pilots. Major Saburo Sakai later described this period as the death of Japanese aviation honor, watching young pilots being prepared for suicide missions because conventional combat had become impossible. Leadership's response revealed the depth of their strategic desperation. General Tojo authorized the development of rocket-powered interceptors, jet aircraft programs, and even research into guided missiles, technologies that Japan's industrial base couldn't support, but represented their only theoretical hope of matching American capabilities. These programs consumed resources desperately needed for conventional aircraft production, while producing prototypes that never reached operational status. The psychological need to believe technological solutions existed was overriding rational resource allocation. The tactical adaptations that emerged from this strategic shift were equally telling. Japanese commanders began planning air operations around the assumption that American air superiority was absolute, focusing on surprise attacks, kamikaze missions, and hit-and-run tactics that avoided sustained combat entirely. Flight training was reduced to basic aircraft handling and navigation, with gunnery practice eliminated to conserve ammunition and fuel. The idea of Japanese pilots engaging American fighters in traditional dogfighting was abandoned as strategically counterproductive. Here's what's particularly tragic about this transformation. Many of Japan's aviation innovations during this period were genuinely advanced, including early jet engine designs, rocket-powered interceptors, and sophisticated radar systems. But their industrial base lacked the capacity to mass-produce these technologies, while American factories were churning out thousands of conventional aircraft that were already superior to anything Japan could field. Innovation without industrial capacity had become militarily meaningless. The bureaucratic machinery of defeat was equally revealing. Japanese aviation procurement shifted from fighter aircraft orders to trainer and transport planes, acknowledging that pilot training and supply missions had become more strategically valuable than air combat capabilities. Factory production schedules were revised to prioritize aircraft maintenance and spare parts over new construction, recognizing that preserving existing aircraft was more realistic than matching American production rates. Commander Horikoshi's final design proposals from this period read like engineering fantasy mouths aircraft specifications that would have matched or exceeded Corsair performance, using materials and manufacturing techniques that existed only on paper. His A7M program represented everything Japanese engineering could theoretically achieve, but the prototype's first flight was delayed repeatedly due to engine failures, structural problems, and manufacturing defects that reflected Japan's collapsing industrial capabilities. The gap between engineering ambition and industrial reality had become unbridgeable. The strategic shift was complete, but the final truth was still emerging. The complete acceptance of American air superiority came not through any single devastating battle, but through the gradual realization that Japan's most fundamental assumptions about warfare itself had become obsolete in the face of industrial-scale military production. By late 1944, Japanese military leadership was confronting a truth that shattered everything they believed about courage, skill, and spiritual superiority. The United States had transformed warfare into an industrial process, where victory belonged to whichever nation could manufacture the most advanced weapons in the greatest quantities. Lieutenant Commander Tetsuzo Iwamoto's final combat report, filed in October 1944, after his squadron was reduced from 24 aircraft to 3 operational fighters, contained an admission that represented the complete psychological surrender of Japan's aviation elite. Writing with the clinical precision that had made him a legendary ace, Iwamoto acknowledged that American pilots flying Corsairs were no longer superior due to equipment advantages. They had become superior pilots through access to unlimited training resources, combat experience gained in survivable aircraft, and tactical innovations enabled by technological supremacy. We taught them to fight, he wrote, and they learned our lessons while building better teachers. The human transformation was most visible in Major Saburo Sakai's post-war interviews, where Japan's greatest surviving ace described the psychological journey from supreme confidence to humble recognition of American achievement. Sakai admitted that his initial contempt for American pilots had been based on early war encounters when Americans were flying inferior aircraft and using poor tactics learned from European combat. By 1944, American Corsair pilots were demonstrating tactical sophistication that exceeded Japanese training while flying aircraft that turned tactical errors into survivable learning experiences rather than fatal mistakes. Commander Horikoshi's private diary entries from the war's final months reveal the complete intellectual and emotional acceptance of technological defeat. The man who had created the Zero-Mo, arguably the most successful fighter aircraft in aviation history during its operational peak, was documenting his recognition that American engineering had achieved something beyond Japanese comprehension. The integration of advanced technology, unlimited resources, and systematic innovation into a military-industrial complex that could outproduce and out-innovate any conceivable opponent. The last desperate attempts at resistance took forms that acknowledged the hopelessness of conventional combat. Kamikaze missions represented not just tactical desperation, but philosophical acceptance that Japanese pilots could no longer survive aerial combat long enough to engage multiple targets. The conversion of experienced fighter pilots into suicide bombers was simultaneously the ultimate expression of Japanese military devotion and complete admission that American air superiority had made traditional combat obsolete. Captain Kaneyoshi Muto's younger brother, Lieutenant Hiroshi Muto, survived the war and later became an aeronautical engineer who worked on Japan's post-war aviation industry. His 1960 interview with American historians contained the most poignant expression of Japanese aviation's transformation. "My brother died fighting American pilots who were flying American aircraft built by American factories, powered by American engines, and trained with American fuel. We were not defeated by superior courage or better tactics. We were defeated by a nation that had turned warfare into industrial production." The emotional weight of this realization had shaped an entire generation of Japanese engineers and pilots. The character transformation from confidence to resignation was completed in the personal writings of Admiral Koga's staff officers, who had begun planning Japan's aerial defense around the assumption that American air attacks were unstoppable rather than attempting to achieve air superiority. Strategic planning documents from early 1945 focused on minimizing damage rather than preventing attacks, acknowledging that the mathematical realities of industrial warfare had made Japanese air defense fundamentally hopeless. Here's the final twist that made this defeat so psychologically complete. Many Japanese pilots developed genuine respect for American aviation achievements, while maintaining their warrior pride intact. Post-war interviews reveal that Japanese aces like Sakai and Iwamoto came to view the Corsair not as a symbol of their defeat, but as evidence of what human engineering could accomplish when supported by unlimited resources and systematic innovation. The airplane that had destroyed Japanese air power had also earned their professional admiration as a masterpiece of military aviation. The statistical summary of the Corsair's impact reads like a transformation of aerial warfare itself. In 64,051 combat sorties, Corsair pilots achieved 2,140 confirmed air-to-air kills, while losing only 189 aircraft to enemy fighters. An 11.31 kill ratio that represented the most dominant fighter performance in aviation history. But these numbers only tell part of the story. The Corsair's psychological impact on Japanese aviation was so complete that by war's end, many Japanese pilots were abandoning perfectly flyable aircraft when Corsairs appeared, rather than engage in combat they knew was hopeless. The post-war reconciliation between former enemies revealed the full scope of what the F4U Corsair had represented in the broader context of 20th century military history. When Major Saburo Sakai met Marine ace Captain Ken Walsh at a 1978 aviation reunion in California, their conversation, recorded by aviation historians, captured the essential truth about technological warfare that the Corsair had first demonstrated. Sakai's opening words to the man who had shot down dozens of his countrymen were unexpectedly gracious. "You flew a magnificent machine. We never had a chance once America decided to win." Commander Horikoshi's post-war career as a technical consultant for Japan's emerging aviation industry provided unique perspective on what American industrial achievement had really meant. Working with Mitsubishi's engineering teams during the 1950s, he frequently referenced Corsair design innovations when explaining advanced manufacturing techniques to Japanese engineers. His 1963 technical paper on aircraft production methods contained a remarkable admission. "The F4U taught us that aircraft design and aircraft manufacturing are inseparable disciplines. American engineers understood this integration while we were still thinking like craftsmen rather than industrialists." Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Whistling Death was its demonstration that courage, skill, and dedication, while admirable and necessary, cannot overcome systematic disadvantages in resources, technology, and industrial capacity when those gaps reach critical thresholds. The Japanese pilots who faced Corsairs in combat were among the most skilled and dedicated aviators in military history, but their individual excellence couldn't compensate for aircraft that were slower, less heavily armed, more fragile, and produced in quantities that made pilot losses strategically catastrophic. The modern relevance of the Corsair story extends far beyond military history into contemporary discussions about technological competition, industrial capacity, and strategic planning. Silicon Valley executives studying competitive advantage often reference the F4U program as an example of how systematic innovation and manufacturing excellence can overcome established market leaders who rely on traditional advantages. The same principles that made Corsair production so devastating to Japanese aviation, integration of advanced technology with scalable manufacturing, continue to determine outcomes in modern technological competition. The universal truth about industrial warfare that the Corsair demonstrated has shaped military thinking ever since. Modern defense analysts studying the F4U's development and deployment recognize it as the first example of systems warfare, where victory resulted not from individual weapon superiority, but from integrated advantages in design, production, training, logistics, and tactical innovation. The aircraft that Japanese pilots initially dismissed as clumsy had actually represented a completely new approach to military aviation that prioritized systematic advantages over traditional pilot skills. The F4U Corsair's transformation from clumsy reject to whistling death represents more than just successful aircraft design. It embodies the moment when modern warfare became an industrial process, where victory belongs to nations capable of systematically outproducing, out-innovating, and out-manufacturing their opponents. In the vast Pacific skies where Japanese Zeros once ruled supreme, the bent-wing birds proved that the future of warfare would be written not by individual heroes, but by the factories, engineers, and industrial systems that could support them.